Hey guys, it's Travis from the Third Gear Speed Shop with part 5 of our detailing a flathead Ford video series. So I think this is going to be probably one of the last few videos we do in this series. Today we're going to be installing the fuel pump, and if you're not familiar with where that's located on a flathead, I'll just show you real quick that this hole right here is where the fuel pump goes, and then we're going to also be dealing with the carb, and the carb goes right here. This is more of a stock setup. A lot of flathead hot rods have 2 carb, 3 carb, up to 4 carb setups, intakes, but this was sort of a low buck jalopy race car, so we're going to keep it simple. We're just going to do the 1 carb and the stock fuel pump. And so what we're going to do is there's a small little fuel line that runs from the fuel pump to the carburetor, and what I've done here, if you can see that, I've just assembled the fuel pump. It's let me see if that will focus. It's having a hard time focusing. So basically what it is, it goes down into the to the intake manifold, and that small little bowl in the front there is where the fuel line goes, and it's having a hard time focusing. But what you want to do is drill a very small hole right about here in the top of that fuel filter bowl, so it pumps the fuel through this bowl and into the carb. So I apologize for not being able to focus it any better, but maybe you can see right there where I drilled a very small hole. Now with this Revell kit, I put a different breather on the top of this, but I did have to attach the bowl to the fuel pump breather. So this is drying right now, but different kits have different fuel pump setups. I prefer the Revell ones just because they're a little bit more detailed, and you know, when you're drilling small holes, you get a better idea of where the inlets are supposed to go. But I drilled a very small hole there, and I'm using a different carb that came with this kit because the carb with this kit was chromed, and for sake of time I didn't want to fool with dechroming it, so I just used an AMT Stromberg carb. But it's the Stromberg style carb. This came out of the 34 kit, the same kit as the body of the jalopy you see in the background. And if you can see, I drilled a hole right there to accept the fuel line. But before I did that, I drilled a larger hole, as you can see, through the whole body of the carb. And it's a little tricky to do that, but I like to have a pin. You know, you could drill a hole in the top and bottom, or drill all the way through. I like to drill all the way through and then just slide a piece of rod up through the carburetor, so that this rod here goes down into the intake, and this rod here, which same rod, the air filter will sit on top of. So you got a lot of surface area to glue your carb. So it's a small little piece, and if you just glue it in there without pinning it, it may have a tendency to break off, because we're going to add air cleaner on top of this, which makes the the intake assembly, the carburation assembly, pretty tall, and you don't want that to snap off over time. So I just like to pin it, just like I like to pin a lot of my small parts together. It takes a little extra time to drill that hole and to get it straight, but it does pay off in the end, just for security and strength. So as you can see, I drilled a small little hole right there. The fuel bowl is in the front of the carburetor, and the fuel comes in on the driver's side. So we're going to be putting that into the intake, and this is going to be the driver's side. So that's the carb. In terms of air filters, there's a bunch of different options. I'm going with more of a stock style air filter on this one. This one's sort of a bigger, one of the oil filled ones. I think it's off of the 37 pickup, and it's one of the larger stock style air filters. I thought it might be appropriate for something like this on a sort of a low buck jalopy, but you can also there's plenty of aftermarket ones. There's some cool ones in the 34 Ford kit, more hot rod style air cleaners, or you can make your own, and I just made a couple here to show you what you could do. If you can just sort of bevel a piece of tube and just slide that on top, and you could face it whichever way you want to give it that sort of hot rod, sort of a homemade hot rod look. So I just made a couple of these to show you what you could do if you wanted to do a different style of homemade air filter. And these actually don't have a filter in them, they're just sort of stacks. So for a jalopy, or in this case my dirt track jalopy, I kind of wanted something that would filter out dirt and keep dust and dirt out of the engine. So I'm opting for the larger style air filter. It doesn't allow as much air into the engine, but it also would trap any rocks or pebbles that may bust up the engine if they got in there. So anyway, so the next step is this. My fuel pump is still drying. I'm going to wait for it to dry before I assemble it. So what I think I'm going to do is, the next step is actually put my carburetor and my fuel filter on my manifold, and then after that is in place, you're going to want to find a piece of very small wire, which I've got here. This is way bigger than you'll need, but you're just going to carefully bend a piece of wire to fit inside those two holes once they're assembled, and then we'll paint it up. So I'm going to wait for this glue to dry, and the next step we will be putting in our fuel line. So another point to note is, if you are running a line from your gas tank to the fuel pump, you're going to want to drill a hole there too, and it usually comes into the fuel pump body itself. So do your research. I'm not doing the fuel line from the gas tank on this particular build, but if I were, I would just do my research and make sure that I drill the hole in the appropriate place. If you're doing a multi-carb setup, a lot of the hot rods would have a fuel block on the firewall, where the fuel line would probably be more of a soft line, like a hose, that would run to that fuel block, and the fuel block would run to the fuel pump. And then more modern street rods and hot rods may even use a electric fuel pump somewhere in the back of the car that would pump the fuel to those fuel blocks. So a bunch of different setups. Just research which era you are building in, and research where all your inlets go and stuff like that. So for this one, it's just going to be more of a simple simple design, stock design, and we're not going to be doing any fuel line from the actual gas tank on this one. So all right, so I'm going to be putting the carb and the fuel pump onto the manifold, and I'll be back. All right, so I'm back, and I don't know if you can see it, but I have, let me get a little pointer out here, right here, this little wire that's bent up, and it's going into my fuel pump. Took me a few tries to get the bend right. As you can see, it bends at a right angle here, down, right angle there, and then there's several bends in this little piece of wire. Let me see if I can get it closer. There are several bends in this little piece of wire here, and it's a little tricky getting it in, but I was able to get it in. As you can see, that's the piece of wire there. So next step is I'm just going to put a small little dab of epoxy on the in these little holes here, and then carefully put this back in using 2-part epoxy. I like to use 2-part epoxy if I'm dealing with metal to plastic. So I'm going to mix up some 2-part epoxy and get my fuel line in place. Depending on your where your fuel pump is, you might have to do some different bends than I did, and if you're using a high-rise intake or whatever, you may, your bends may be a little different than mine. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and glue the fuel pump or the fuel line into the fuel pump and carburetor. And I think the next step after that, I'm going to go ahead and paint those up. I'm going to paint the fuel pump a silver color, and probably paint the carburetor a silverish gold color as well. And then paint up my air filter and drop it on top of my carb like so. And after it's all painted up, we'll be ready for the headers. And I've already made the headers here. I scratch built my own headers. But if you are using aftermarket headers, or if you are using stock headers, whichever road you're going down with the exhaust system, basically I just I have holes drilled into my exhaust ports, and I'll just be sliding those headers into the exhaust ports and gluing them in that way. So probably the next video will be our final, and it will be basically a final reveal or a final on what it looks like when it's all finished. I'm also going to, like I said in the previous video, I'm going to paint the whole engine in a dull coat just to seal it up and dull everything down. So all right, thanks for watching, and the next video will be our last one in this series, and it will be the final on how to wire and detail a flathead Ford V8. So stay tuned for that, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.